Everyone, and welcome. This is Professor Hall, and we are talking again about modernism, literary changes, and characteristics. If you missed the last lecture, please go back and watch it because I give a lot of historical background about some of the events that were going on from 1914 through 1945 that affected the literature we're going to be studying in this class. And I have a picture here because I just love, it's not just about the literature, which we are focusing on. Obviously, this is an English class, but film and Hollywood and art and music, all of those things kind of follow a lot of the same trends. So I think it's kind of interesting to talk about some of those things as well as we get into what was being written. So the pre-modern world, by this, modernism is used in a number of different ways. For this class, we are talking about modernism, 1914 to 1945, the pre-modern world before 1914. For the most part, in art, in music, in literature, we see things that are ordered, meaningful, relatively optimistic, for the most part stable. People have a clear sense of identity. They're guided by faith and morality and values. So here's a nice picture of some lovely ladies in that Edwardian period, just before we come up to modernism. You can see a little bit of kind of sense, hopefully hard work. This woman is doing the dishes. Oh, I'm sorry. No, she's kneading a pan full of dough. So she's about to bake bread in her little wooden house. A lot of agrarianism. So a society based in farming. And there we go. You can see this woman standing beside the men as they hay the field. So they've got the horses hooked up to hay the field for the coming fall, to feed the horses over the winter. And here are men in suits and ladies in dresses, high necklines, right? Low, long skirts, and that kind of thing. So after that, what we have as the effects of World War I, if you saw the previous video, a lot of people felt that it was an exercise of futility, that you basically had European countries worried that they were going to take over the colonies that they had all established, which did happen basically after World War II. Most of the colonies go to self-rule. But because of that, because of the horrors of World War I, the writers of this age are quite pessimistic. They say the world as unstable and chaotic. They, for the most part, have a loss of faith, which is going to be extremely important in the things that we read. And I don't want to get too dour here, but because of this, a lot of these authors struggled with things like adulterous affairs, suicide, depression, alcoholism, drug addiction, all of that, because they have a confused sense of identity and place in the world. There's a collapse of morality and values, and they kind of, for many of them, see life as being pointless. This is, it's not really funny, I guess, but this is a political cartoon saying the descent of the modernists, that they felt, this person at least felt like people were moving away from the tenets of Christianity. No miracles, no virgin birth means no deity, which means no atonement. And then, is God even real at all? And then they're in this place of atheism where they don't believe in really anything. And to a certain extent, that does happen, at least to some of the writers that we're going to be looking at. Because of this too, we have this idea in the 1920s, it's called the Roaring Twenties for a reason, right? That if all of that is true and none of it matters, why not just live for the moment? Why not indulge in everything that you can, right? So here is a jazz musician surrounded by lovely ladies of the theater, who probably at the time would have been called loose women by some other people. This is a very famous image of the men having lunch, but you can kind of see, again, the instability and the fearlessness when you have that idea. This is a Charlie Chaplin movie called Modern Times, and it's the idea that men who were working in factories were kind of getting pulled into the cogs and the machinery, that the assembly lines that were developed by Henry Ford were beginning to churn out things that all looked the same. There's no craftsmanship anymore. The craftsman movement actually comes large part out of this because of the machinery. But that's part of what's happening in the country as a whole. And then we also have the Great Depression, the chaos and the collapse of the Great Depression, the Dust Bowls that I talked about before, the high rates of unemployment, nearly topping out at about 25%. So 1 in 4 people is looking for a job, and people are suffering and hungry and everything else. So all of these kind of converge together. This chaos, this pessimism, the instability, the loss of faith, the idea that it's a machine, that you're part of a machine rather than being an individual. And this comes out in art and music, as I said, as well as literature. So just kind of to give you some visual examples, the pre-modern period of art. Now, we have, this is from a pre-Raphaelite, the Lady of Shalott in her gorgeous boat with the tapestry she's woven. The pre-Raphaelites believed in depicting things realistically, but we also have the Impressionists like Monet and Renoir, who are very aware that now that there are cameras, you can capture things with 100% realism. So they want to form impressions. What is the movement of the moment, as we see here with Degas? What is the feeling of the two sisters sitting at the piano? What is your impression of the sky as a woman stands shielding herself from the sun with an umbrella, right? All of that kind of goes on, but you can see in the colors and basic shapes are still there. I mean, you see the impression of the girls behind her, but you still know that that's a ballerina. Here you can tell that it's a woman with an umbrella and her young son behind her, right, on a field. And what happens in the modern period is that a lot of that gets thrown away. So this is a piece of art from a period that's known as the Art Deco period, smooth lines and that kind of thing. You can see the rush and the busyness and the colors as well. So people in a movie theater, going to the doctor, having a smoke, watching the trapeze artists, being at a bar, it seems like, going to a jazz club and dancing and all of that, all in one very busy, kind of somewhat broken up piece, right? Then we come to something like this, where you have to ask yourself, what is it? It seems to me to be an interpretation of music, and what the artist feels when they hear a piece. We've got possibly a man here with a guitar and some musical notes. But I think you can also see possibly a bicycle. This looks like a musical instrument as well, maybe a bass and some hands reaching out to play it, but maybe not. The craziness of what's going on there, it's quite open to interpretation. And this is in a large part what some of our literary artists are trying to do as well. They're being very experimental in their form. And I want you to know this, because sometimes when I give pieces that are a little more experimental to students, they're sometimes like feel like they should know what it means, and it doesn't always have to mean anything. Is this a jazz club? Maybe. There also seem to be some dragonflies and cats. So maybe a chicken over here. My point is that it's meant to be up to interpretation. It's meant to have you ask questions and feel uncomfortable and that kind of thing. This says at the bottom, this is not a pipe, trying to make you think about the symbolism of art. It's not a pipe, it's a painting of a pipe. And actually, as I'm talking, it's not a painting of a pipe. It's a digital image in a PowerPoint presentation that was taken from a photograph of the painting of the pipe. So we're very far removed. What this is called, if you've heard this term before, other than with the company formerly known as Facebook, but it's supposed to be very meta. It's making you think not just about the picture, but about art itself. What is art? What makes a piece of art good? What makes a piece of art stand out? All of that kind of thing. This is Pablo Picasso's Guernica, and I love this painting. Inspired by the Spanish Civil War. When you zoom in, you can kind of see the people crying over the dead bodies. There's another body here. The cow being confused, and even the horse is screaming with the light from the barn as people rush in, and other people are trampled. It's quite, I think, a powerful piece, but again, experimental in form. This is not like Picasso's earlier works where you can tell if someone is a guitar player, or, if you see like his blue period, his rose period, a lot of that, you can tell what it is. But he's experimenting with form here, with cubism, and you can kind of make out what he's saying, but again, a lot of it is open to interpretation. We also have Jackson Pollock, who is known for what many children do in school. Just kidding. I don't want to make him seem like he's not an important artist, because his is about color and feeling. But this splatter paint effect is, again, what we're going to find in a lot of literature. The idea that there's chaos and no real meaning in life. The idea here that life might be hopeless and that we might not have faith because of some of the horrors that we've seen. Found art here and here. And we also have the color blocking up here. From modern art, again, trying to make you think about what art means and what it is. And I'm forgetting the name of the guy who did these paintings, but I've been to a museum that had a whole room of these, and a couple of people just standing there staring at the color. And I asked the person who was doing the tour, what the heck? And he said, well, you're supposed to kind of look at it, and just whatever feeling comes to you is whatever feeling comes to you. So if you see this orange and you see a window and a sunrise, then that's what it means to you. If you see this orange and you just see the color orange twice or three times over, that's what it means to you. If it makes you angry that this is on a wall of a gallery along with beautiful paintings of countrysides, then that's what it means to you. And that is, again, what we're going to find in the literature. Subjective meaning, that for a lot of this, it means whatever it means to the person writing it and the person reading it. That you can have more than one interpretation. Now, you can't have any interpretation at all. You can't look at Guernica and say that this is a scene of a delightful garden party where the queen is coming in, because there's no evidence for that, right? But if it means one thing to you and another thing to another person, if you have one emotional reaction, or you have one part that sticks out, and somebody else has another part that sticks out, that is perfectly fine. And that's kind of what the modernists were sort of getting at. So, in literature prior to this, we have Romanticism and we have Realism. I'm going to get out my little highlighter here. So, Romanticism was a literary movement in the 1800s that emphasized improbable events and strong emotion and kind of pre-psychology ideas about motivations for characters, faraway places. We get out of this the Gothic stories where there are castles and dark passageways and that kind of thing. And then out of that comes realism around the time of the Civil War in the United States, where we have different regions. A type of realism is known as regionalism. And we have people like Mark Twain describing what it's like down in Mississippi. We have people like Bret Hart talking about what it's like during the gold rushes in Nevada. And so as the country's trying to kind of reunify, there are also all of these different places keeping their own traditions and cultures and things like that. But a lot of this was seen as overly sentimental. And Donna Campbell explains in the 1890s, there was a backlash against local color and genteel fiction. These previous works emphasized sentimental nostalgia and verisimilitude. So depicting life as it really was in certain regions of the United States. The naturalists come soon after this, but their works are a little bit more cynical than previous writers, but they're still very traditional in terms of form. So we have, if you read something like Tom Sawyer, sentimentality and nostalgia, looking back at the past with fondness and without pain, that's basically the definition of nostalgia. Little Women is another good example. Little Women takes place during the Civil War, but outside of the father being gone, you might not fully realize that because it is, for the most part, a kind of gentle story about these four sisters, right? Living in Massachusetts. The Red Badge of Courage by Stephen Crane, a little bit after the Civil War, and it is a naturalist story, a little bit more cynical and questioning things like fate and traditionally held values like loyalty. So kind of setting some of the way for the people who come later. A lot of literature, very often when we talk about literary movements, people are pushing toward the future and reacting to the past. When we have the modernists, they're taking some of the values of these naturalists and they're exacerbating them. They're making them, they're putting even higher of an emphasis on them. So as the naturalists are doing social commentary and embracing a little bit more of detachment, determinism, the idea that people and their lives are affected by these outside forces, and they also have scientific objectivism. The modernists are kind of taking some of those principles and then they're questioning them. And as I said, it's even more cynical than the naturalists were thought to be, basically. I don't know why the headlines are coming up after, but that's all right. So the modernists emerge after World War I. They want to overturn the traditional modes of expression. So as we talked about last time, the war really had a huge effect on these writers, the Lost Generation, I think, in particular, whereas I think other movements like the Harlem Renaissance was really driven by other social factors like people of color moving from the South up to the North and then finding these mostly insular communities where they could be quite successful in ways that had not been possible previously. But even those writers and many of the other movements we'll talk about in a moment are reassessing the prevailing ideas of society. So the subjective reality of the world. How does psychology affect our personal experience? How do we doubt that realism is real? You're trying to say that you're writing something with verisimilitude, and having all of these things that portray it as real as possible, but that's your perspective. And my perspective might be quite different. So how can one depict something realistically if your experiences or beliefs or psychological makeup cast a shadow onto that perception? And just as we saw with the art, and if you're in my class, you'll hear with some of the music, these writers started to be a little bit more experimental. So we have people doing things like poetry in new forms that hadn't really been seen before. We have things like short stories that are not fully connected, but are of all these people in one town, like the book by Sherwood Anderson. We have Gertrude Stein writing things that even today are thought to be kind of non-comprehensible. We have people writing in stream of consciousness and developing kind of a new way of writing, or at least something that looked like a new way of writing. But you can see here, even in the dress, right? The clothing style, from the long skirts and puffy sleeves and high neckline to the low neckline and short skirts and all of that kind of thing. So some of the movements in modernism that I've mentioned already, the Lost Generation, those are primarily people who came of age during the war, people who came into their 20s, some of whom served in World War I. They were also present for maybe the Spanish Civil War in some cases, and many of them became expatriates who lived in Europe. We also have the Imagist poets who are sometimes writing poems a lot like the art we just saw, where you have one image to focus on, and is there a meaning to the poem, or is the meaning whatever you take out of it? We have more experimental poetry. We have the writers of the Harlem Renaissance. That is really going to be driven by not just the movement of people to the north, but also a lot of the philosophy of the time. Prevailing thoughts before the Harlem Renaissance were that people who were African American should just, now that slavery had ended, should just work in kind of menial labor jobs and try to get some education. By the Harlem Renaissance, these people are like, yeah, we have education and we have colleges and we've been there, we have degrees, and now we want to go beyond menial jobs. We want to create art and music and literature and not just participate in society, but really be a driving force in it. And there are a group of them. The Southern Renaissance writers, people who are living in the South. Drama becomes a more major genre as well. And we have some marginalized voices, feminist writers. We have new gender and sexuality perspectives. I think I mentioned Gertrude Stein previously. She writes a book about her lover, Alice B. Toklas. Admitting that they were lesbians at this point in time would have been quite scandalous, and for many reasons. So all of that starts to come up during this time. New ethnic and class perspectives, new perspectives on gender and sexuality, perspectives on race from the people of that race, not just other people commenting on it. And here are some other characteristics of modern literature. Using irony and understatement, so lots of sarcasm here and there. People like Dorothy Parker, quite known for that. A focus on the inner self and the psychology of characters. Disillusionment, loss of faith and innocence that we talked about earlier. Optimism is replaced with cynicism and alienation. And in particular, you might see this as a theme in which we have an optimistic character who eventually becomes cynical or alienated, particularly as they come of age. A person who has faith and has hope and eventually becomes disillusioned. So the inner self of the characters as well. And I'll put in irony too. There we go. Individualism of the characters, but also of the writers, experimentation and form, as I said, and a rejection of traditions. Now, some people think that this is just of religion. It really isn't. It's looking at the economic hierarchy, Does capitalism work, or is it garbage? What is the class structure? How is that keeping people oppressed? How are people of various races affected? How are people kept out of things because of their gender or because of their sexuality? Interestingly enough, I just mentioned Gertrude Stein, and she held salons in which she talked to mostly men, and sometimes their wives, and sometimes she would tell her lover to talk to their wives because she couldn't be bothered. So still kind of exclusionary in some sense. Yeah. So here we have a group of, I believe that's the Southern Renaissance writers. You can see all older white gentlemen. Idealistic heroes replaced with everyday men, and even some anti-heroes as well. So we start moving from hero and villain to protagonist and antagonist. If you read older literature, sometimes hero and villain, it's very cut and dry. We have black and white kind of dichotomy. Now we're moving away from that. Our protagonists, our main characters are not always perfect. Meandering plots, unreliable narrators, the instability of the world. I have tried to get you things that are not too meandering, but it does sometimes happen. It doesn't go just from A to B. We take some stops along the way, and we care much more about the journey of the characters than just the starting point and the destination. Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner is a book that is known to have kind of an experimental structure. It's 4 sections, all told from different perspectives. Some from characters and one section from an omniscient narrator. So again, that would be kind of unique to have multiple first-person narrators and then also a third-person narrator in the same book. So, the carnage of World War I and the Spanish Civil War, the Holocaust and atrocities of World War II, yet another piece of evidence that humanity had taken a wrong turn. The machines of war, industry, transportation, and writing during this period of time really tries to demonstrate the idea that they held that life was absurd and incomprehensible. This is a very young Ernest Hemingway here. That you could not understand it. This is the people at the Algonquin Round Table, Dorothy Parker here in the hat, and the other people there are writing things that are filled with irony and sarcastic wit, little quips, as she, I think, says is quoted in a clip I have for you guys. I write doodads because it's a doodad kind of world. Meaning, I'm not trying to write anything important. Now, other people like Hemingway and Fitzgerald, they were trying to write the great American novel to capture what was going on at the time, to hone their craft. But other writers were not. And they were kind of just trying to show that life is sort of silly and absurd, and we can't really fully understand it. And some of these writers were termed the lost generation. They felt disillusioned and disconnected from life, and they were quite lost. And actually, everyone, kind of like we have the boomers and Gen X and millennials and Gen Z and whatever. I don't even know. So too many letters. But this whole generation was termed the lost generation because of this. They seemed to be kind of vagabonds and wanderers and people who were really looking for meaning and trying to find meaning outside of what had been the prevailing ideas of morality of the past. So those are some things to look for. I'd also like you to look for experimentation, which I've already mentioned, breaking free from old forms and techniques, the psychological inner workings of consciousness, the preoccupation with form, things like stream of consciousness that I mentioned, poets abandoning traditional rhyme scheme, making up words, ignoring grammar. There's Gertrude Stein and there's Alice in the background. Up there, Sherwood Anderson, blending genres, so mixing together free writing and poetry, and the cross between poetry and music is quite close at this time. Mixing a little bit of biography with their fiction, so that you can't always fully tell what is real and what is made up. Symbolism. Here is the guitar player, I think by Vermeer. And this is Picasso's guitar player, which if I outline it, I think you'll be able to maybe kind of see if I zoom in real fast. Oh, I can't. But anyway, there's the guitar, there are the strings, there's the arm holding it, another arm holding it at the head up at the top. You can kind of make out through the cubism a guitar player, but this is what people are trying to do in their writing as well, right? So moving away just from realism and complete verisimilitude. We do have some modern regionalists, but again, they're very interested in the psychology of the characters and the symbolic meaning of things. If you've read The Great Gatsby, I think it doesn't translate well as a movie because so much of it is symbolic. Having the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg, having Daisy always in white, not because she's pure, but because there's really nothing going on there. She's quite vapid. All of those things, a lot of things is infused with symbolism. Reality has multiple layers. The readers kind of hunt out and decipher what things mean to them. The writing is like a puzzle to solve. And a lot of it's left up to your imagination and your own psychology and what you bring into it. So Robert Frost is writing at this time, but keeping more in the traditional form and kind of fighting a lot of the other modernist writers and what they're doing. So I have this clip from his poem, this excerpt rather. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep and miles to go before I sleep. Lovely words, really going against a lot of the traditions. He makes fun of this too in his other poem, I Took the Road Less Traveled By, that's always cited, but he's making fun of the other modernists who think that they're doing something new and different, but it's the road less traveled by. Like, other people have still traveled it, and he's kind of like calling them hipsters, basically. Hipsters or posers or kind of whatever you want to put. But here is a thing from Tender Buttons, Objects by Gertrude Stein. Within the cut and slender joint alone, with sudden equals and no more than 3, 2 in the center make 2 one side. If the elbow is long and it is filled, so then the best example is altogether. The kind of show is made by squeezing. Now, she's talking about scissors, which are depicted here as one of the objects, right? And this is somebody who put together this little, piece of with pictures. So it wouldn't have been in the original poem. But you can tell if you didn't really have the picture or you didn't know necessarily what she was talking about, it's quite meandering and experimental. And if you're in the Lost Generation class, don't worry, I'm not going to have you try to guess what all of her writing means. And we won't read the whole books that she wrote because they are quite meandering. But I do think it's interesting just to see that she was a huge art lover, an art collector, and put a lot of her money into paintings by up-and-coming modern artists, and was a friend of Picasso. And I think you can see that here. If you think about this poem like the Picasso guitar player, it's all jumbled, right? The sudden equals no more than 3, 2 in the center, make 1 on a side. The kind of show it's made by squeezing, as opposed to just saying the one arm of the scissors is longer than the other. It looks almost like 3 parts, and you can cut things when squeezing the handles together, right? It's meant to just have you think about words and syntax and word order and what things are and what they mean and all of that. So if you were in my Lost Generation class, we will talk about them next. If you're in my Harlem Renaissance class, we'll talk about them next. And I am really excited to dig into this with all of you. So until then, have a great week, everybody. Thank you.